Welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, where every week we fight the good fight. Greetings. I'm here with my friend and colleague, Mr. Nick Pope, who has been very, very well known in the UFO community for a long time. Nick worked at the UK Ministry of Defense for more than 2 full decades. He, of course, is best known for his work at the, I believe it's the Secretariat office, Nick, where you studied worked on the UFO phenomenon from 1991 to 1994, really the UK's analogous office to Project Blue Book that the United States Air Force had. You've written some excellent books on the subject. You've been speaking about this to the world for many years, and it's a pleasure to have you on the Richard Dolan Show. How are you?
Thank you. It's good. All good. Glad to be on the show with you. I think we've got a lot of interesting things to chat about.
I'm absolutely looking forward to this. And, you know, we've known each other for, oh golly, about 16, 17, 18 years. We went through a long period where people always got us confused with each other. Do they still do that anymore, by the way?
Yes, they do. Absolutely. I had at least one person come up to me at Alien Con Baltimore and say how much they'd enjoyed one of the sessions. And I thought, that's not my session. And I said, hey, you don't mean Richard Dolan, do you? So yeah, even though I think I have tried, for example, not that I did this to deconflict, but as you have noticed, I've stopped wearing my glasses on most of the new TV shows that I do and most of the panels. So, and of course, I'm clean shaven, always have been. So I think our appearance has diverged, but I also think we do go for the same kind of sartorial image, a nice coat jacket, a collared shirt, that kind of thing.
Yes, and in fact, I recall at least on one conference, we had the exact same color blue shirt. And I was clean shaven back then, had the short hair. We did look much more alike at that time, I would say.
Yes, indeed.
Well, I'm glad that my people are still horning in on you, asking you about my lectures. So that makes me happy. In all seriousness, it's really good to have you on. And I wonder if you can give, I mean, look, you've spoken about your career many, many times, but if you don't mind, just giving people an overview of what exactly you did at the Ministry of Defense back during the 1990s when you ran a UFO desk. I mean, even that alone is significant to tell people about. What was the nature of this work that you did back in those days?
Sure. As you said yourself in the intro, the broad analogy is that what I did was very much along the lines of Project Blue Book. It was a public UFO program. Our brief was to research and investigate the phenomenon to determine whether anything reported was of any defense significance to the UK, and specifically whether any object or phenomenon detected in the UK air defense region posed any threat or potential threat to the UK, or offered up something of maybe more general scientific or defense interest. And those terms were not necessarily defined very specifically, and that was quite deliberate so as to give us some flexibility in that. So the bread and butter of the job was getting about 200 to 300 cases each year, largely from the public, but often from police officers, pilots, military personnel. We didn't discriminate, except I have to say we probably did favor reports from what we would consider more credible sources. So, for example, if a commercial airline pilot came to us with a sighting, simultaneously tracked on radar, so that you have something over and above just testimony, that was useful. We investigated those cases. In most instances, we were able to identify a prosaic explanation for that, and in some cases we were not. The statistics broke down very approximately like this: 80% misidentification of all the usual things, aircraft lights, weather balloons, satellites, etc. 15% insufficient data to make any meaningful assessment, and 5% unknown. Now, as we always were eager to clarify, 5% unknown did not mean 5% extraterrestrial. Unknown means unknown, nothing more, nothing less. It may be that with a little bit more investigation, we would have been able to turn up a conventional explanation or not.
I would wonder, you started that office back in 1991, and it just occurred to me, clearly you were not the first person to run that office or to work in that office. So the office, I assume, had been established for quite some time?
Yes, the MOD's formal UFO program dated back actually to 1953.
Mm-hmm.
But before 1953, on a more ad hoc basis, in other words, outside of any formally constituted program, clearly there were sightings, and these were looked at. I mean, going back, for example, to the Second World War and the so-called Foo Fighters. Certainly, Bomber Command had in its case files a number of instances where crews on bombing missions over Germany and occupied parts of Europe had encountered not just balls of light, but on occasion structured craft that at the time were assessed as probably being Axis weapons of some sort, aircraft or weapon systems. Subsequently, we walked that back somewhat. But so from the Second World War onwards, this was looked at, but it was 1953 before we actually set up a program with formal terms of reference. And the titles changed over the years. As you mentioned in your intro, when I did it, it was Secretariat Air Staff. Before that, it was Defense Secretariat 8. Over the years, it's been all sorts of different things. That's why, in a sense, it's very confusing, and people have erroneously thought that there were multiple programs. In fact, there weren't. It was just essentially the same thing, but under not even different names, but embedded in different parts of first the Royal Air Force and later on the Ministry of Defense. And I'm wondering, I fondly wished that we had given ourselves a project title like Blueberry. It would have been far better in terms of continuity.
Well, I'm just thinking, you were there for those years during the 90s, so clearly there was continuity at the office, and for 40 years before you arrived there, nearly. And I mean, it just seems odd to me that there would be no provisional conclusions as to what these UFOs or these UAP or these unidentified objects might be. Doesn't it strike you as a little, I mean, wouldn't it make sense that there would be at least certain theories and conclusions around the office as to what some of these objects might be, or is that just not how it operated there?
It's an interesting question with a very complex answer. I think the simple answer to
Don't mean to put you on the spot, Nick. I just thought I'd ask.
Well, that's your job. That's your job doing the interview. So the simple short answer is that there was a conclusion, and that conclusion was that the UFO phenomenon was of, quote, no defense significance, unquote. However, that patronizing, dismissive three-word soundbite, no defense significance, was really something that was a bit of a cop-out. It was to give us something, and specifically to give us something to deploy with British Parliament, the media, and the wider public when they inquired about this. But to a very real extent, it was a fatally flawed assessment, which I believed, and a number of my colleagues believed, just simply was a non sequitur in terms of the actual data that we had. A more honest assessment would probably have been, we don't know. Now, that's not to say that over the years there weren't theories put forward, and there were a number of often mutually contradictory theories put forward, depending on the particular I guess, pet theory of whoever the subject matter expert was at the time. I mean, some people favored the idea that this was some sort of mirage. Others favored the possibility of some exotic atmospheric plasma phenomenon. Some people over the years had genuinely put forward at least the possibility that this might be extraterrestrial. And my own conclusion was that certainly we could not rule out that possibility. But I think the more honest answer is we simply don't know. We had a confusing bunch of data, often pointing in different directions. And the problem was that for decades, this had been looked at almost really on a case-by-case basis. A new sighting would be reported, whoever it was would do an investigation. What nobody was doing was trend analysis, trying to put all this together, join the dots and say, well, what does all this mean? What have we got here?
Right. It was a constant state of amnesia every time a new case would come along, which indeed is how it appears even in the our contemporary culture when a new UFO sighting happens. And I'm just jumping ahead to, when the Tic Tac UFO became widely known a year ago, it was as if, oh my goodness, there was a UFO encounter with the United States Navy, as if this had never happened before. And we start at square one, and it sounds that's very much what you're describing at the MOD.
Well, we forget our history, absolutely. And when I say we, I don't just mean the UFO community, the media, and the public. I mean even those of us in formally constituted UFO projects. We forget our history. And I was sitting in there in an office in Ministry of Defense headquarters building with a whole bunch of real-life X-Files behind me, but hundreds more back in the archives, which I would dip into and read. But it was amazing. Not all the desk officers who had been posted into that position over the years, either before me or after me, not everyone dipped into the archive, and I didn't do it.
I would have done like you. I would have been a maniac. I would have just dove in and read every single report that I could.
Well, absolutely, not just out of intellectual curiosity, but out of the desire to do my job properly. Because I felt, how could I do my job properly if I wasn't aware of the history? But the corporate memory in the Ministry of Defense, not just on UFOs, but frankly on almost any subject. And it's not just the Ministry of Defense, it's all government and agencies, and indeed private corporations. The corporate memory is often very patchy.
I have a lot of questions that are lining up here, and I'm just trying to decide where I want to go. But I'm going to hold off on that because it just seems it's maddening to think that one is part of a formal, bureaucratic, well-funded, at least the Ministry of Defense, well-funded operation, and one is dealing with a phenomenon of at least potential, not simply national security, defense significance, but just great significance to humanity. And there's really not a systematic analysis that's being done, but I'll just leave that. And, can I ask you about your time in the MOD, in that office, the Secretariat Air Staff? You did investigate, you looked into some very interesting cases that happened at the time. I remember reading about the very interesting sightings, I believe, of triangular objects in 1993. But I think there had to have been others that you encountered during your time there. And I just wondered, were there any cases that you investigated back then that really got your attention as making you think these are very interesting and really unexplained?
Sure. We had actually since the 80s a number of cases of vast objects, often triangular shaped, but on occasion rectangular shaped as well. And the phrase, one occasionally heard the phrase flying football field to discuss these sorts of things, with the witnesses just picking out the analogy of a football field to try and convey just the sheer size of these things, often either completely silent or with a very low frequency humming sound. And yes, I think the case that you alluded to took place over a series of about 6 hours in the UK, from about 8:30 p.m. on the evening of March 30th, 1993, to about 2:40 a.m. the following morning. And we had a number of sightings. The witnesses were a mixed bag of public, police, and military. And 2 Air Force bases in particular, RAF Cosford and RAF Shawbury, were directly overflown by this object. We did find at about 1:10 in the morning a cluster of sightings that were attributable, or probably attributable, to a Russian rocket burning up in the Earth's atmosphere after a satellite launch. But we were able to factor that in to our investigation, take account of it, and eliminate those sightings. And what was left was absolutely fascinating. And in particular, the overflight at 2:40. It was actually the last reported sighting on that night. A number of other fascinating ones. I think at about 10 o'clock at night, we'd had a report where a member of the public described something so big it was like 2 Concorde aircraft pasted together. We had a bizarre incident where somebody thought that this object was so low that it had come down in a field. And when they walked into the field, there was nothing there except a whole bunch of, I think there were cows, all stood in a huge circle facing each other. And it was absolutely surreal and like something out of the X-Files. But the Shawbury witness, he was a meteorological officer. And when I interviewed him the following morning, his voice still shaking, he described this object flying very slowly over the base, no more than maybe 30 or 40 miles an hour, perhaps 200 feet above the ground. Low frequency humming sound.
Russian or Soviet satellites.
No. I mean, we had the Ballistic Missile Early Warning Center at RAF Fylingdales, who have space tracking radar. They were a routine part of our UFO investigations, and I was obviously in regular contact with them. But specifically over this case, we talked a lot, and I had access to all the data. But this witness described to me the UFO firing a pencil-thin beam of light down at the ground, which he said tracked backwards and forwards as if it were looking for something. And then he said that beam of light retracted. And then from this slow speed of maybe no more than 30 or 40 miles an hour, he said this thing accelerated away to the horizon. And this is a man with 8 years experience in the Air Force of witnessing fast attack helicopters, military jets. And he said to me, Nick, this was orders of magnitude above and beyond the speed of that. But he said just the acceleration from 30 or 40 miles an hour to high Mach speeds just in an instant. I mean,
that's incredible.
We drew a complete blank, of course.
Yeah, you would have to draw a complete blank in terms of anything conventional that we have in the inventory, whether UK, US, or any other nation. I can't possibly imagine. So what the conclusion was simply unknown, or was there any additional speculation, conclusion about what this object was or what it was doing?
Well, the only speculation that we really entered into, which held water, was the idea that this was some sort of secret prototype hypersonic aircraft or drone. Now, we did not necessarily have specific need to know about specific black programs. However, had we been poking our noses into such a program, we would have very quickly and quietly, without being given the details, just been warned off. Now, that didn't happen. Additional to that, I should say that if the suspicion was, as had been mooted, that this was a US aircraft, there are extremely strict diplomatic clearance rules about flying in other people's airspace. And it just so happened that the DipClear cell, the diplomatic clearance, people were actually another part of Secretariat air staff. So they were literally the guy in the same office as me was the guy that I checked those points with. And there were other people in the Air Force as well. And of course, we reached out through the embassies. Actually, we nearly caused a diplomatic incident on this because, really? Yes, we speculated that this was a US aircraft, and there have been some articles in the aviation press about the possibility of something codenamed Aurora. And the US Secretary of Defense had denied that any such aircraft existed or had certainly been test flown in the UK. And then I think somebody either in the embassy or the defense intelligence staff, one of my colleagues, I can't remember who it was, made the mistake of, I think, putting on paper somewhere a phrase that said, despite the denials, it wouldn't surprise us if such an aircraft existed. And it was relayed back to us in no certain terms. And I will never forget the phrase. It was something like the Sec Def was incandescent with rage at the suggestion that he had misled Congress.
That might have been William Perry, I think, was Perry Clinton's first secretary?
I can't recall, and I'm not sure how much of this has actually been declassified and released, so I better not get into it.
Well, that's fine. The Aurora project, I mean, lots of speculation has occurred about that, but even if there is or was an Aurora craft, which is, I think, totally possible, that's always been described as a hypersonic, I've always thought very high altitude, very, very fast object that wouldn't be hovering and wasn't gargantuan in size either, and wouldn't be hovering 200 feet above the ground, clearly at such a slow speed, slower than any stall speed for any aircraft that I can think of anyway, 30 miles per hour, with a pencil thin laser-like light. Or that doesn't sound like Aurora, does it?
It doesn't. However, I should say that in the shadowy world of intelligence, sometimes one tries to hide or disguise a capability that one has. And conversely, sometimes you try to maybe put out a story about a capability that you don't actually have. So it's all smoke and mirrors. And of course, in aviation, technology, depending on who you ask, is thought to run anywhere between 10 and maybe 30 or 30 plus years ahead of anything publicly declared. So there is always a gray area. But to those of us who were investigating these sightings at the time, I have to say we still felt that the secret prototype aircraft or drone theory was unlikely, but not impossible.
I wonder, I don't want to, beat this sighting to death, but it's really interesting. And, the areas that it appeared to be investigating, was there any significance to that anyone thought of? Like why there, what might it have been looking for, and so forth? Was that part of the analysis?
Well, the danger with those sorts of things is that you're only looking at an incomplete part of the picture. So if you factor in, we had over the course of that 6-hour period, maybe if we counted reports that came to us secondhand, maybe we had 60, 70, 80 witnesses. But if you then factor in the underreporting of UFOs, either because of the fear of ridicule, disbelief, or simply people who don't know who to reach out to about this, when you say, okay, where did this UFO go? What was it interested in? What was it looking at? You've only got perhaps a fraction of the puzzle. So the danger is that we say, Royal Air Force bases, Cosford and Shawbury, so the military is of interest. But then we forget, or if we rush to judgment on this, we forget that actually, I mentioned earlier, the bizarre case of just over a farmer's field somewhere in Wales or down in Somerset. So I think that the simple answer to that is we don't know, because we don't have all the geographical locations. I mean, actually, my head of division, who was a complete skeptic on the UFO issue, did not like the fact that this work was embedded in his section at all. Even he, literally a couple of days after, came running into my office like an overexcited schoolboy. He started trying to map this out on a blank map of the UK, and he'd drawn all these zigzags and arrows, and he'd said, "Look, I think there's a pattern developing." And I wasn't sure there was, but it was an interesting example of how even this skeptical senior defense official had kind of got caught up in the moment here.
That's very interesting. Yeah, absolutely. So you, I know there was many other cases. In fact, you wrote about that particular case in your first book, which I have. I love that book. It's called Open Skies, Closed Minds. And I recall you described that night in some detail, but I have to admit, I forgot some of those details. So I'm glad that you're recounting it now. And I would actually highly recommend that book to anyone who's interested in the UFO phenomenon. I think it actually remains really one of the top level books on the subject, particularly for someone who is an open-minded skeptic who wants good information, reliable information from a government source. And you actually provide that very nicely in that book. And I do know you cover that evening. I think that's how I learned about it, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. Yes, I think it was the first time that this had been brought out. And of course, Open Skies, Closed Minds, along with all my books, had to go through Ministry of Defense Security vetting, so that I'm not a whistleblower. I take my secrecy oath very seriously. It binds me for life, even though I've left Ministry of Defense employ in 2006. But I am not a whistleblower. I'm very careful about not divulging classified information, and that's why I pre-submit all my manuscripts to the Ministry of Defense in case I've inadvertently put in something which is classified. And of course, as and when they ask me to take anything out, I do so.
I will simply add, there have been a number of times that colleagues of yours, and myself included, have tried to loosen you up as much as possible and have seriously failed every time. So it really is true. Like, you are very good about that. And I think we respect that. I certainly do. So,
well, thanks. I know it's not always popular in the UFO community, because I know that and maybe we'll get onto a debate about whistleblowers. The problem I have with whistleblowers, and I'm not now talking about UFOs, but more generally,
right.
When you get these people who say, my goodness, look at this crossed my desk, and I think the American people have a right to know. Two problems with that. Firstly, the person deciding to leak that information is usually not the subject matter expert. So they're usually not ideally placed. They're not placed at all to make the damage assessment and to say, well, what would the consequences be of disclosing this information? And as I say, I stress, I'm not just talking about UFOs, I'm talking about any subject. But the second, far bigger problem related to that is for all the people who trumpet phrases like, well, the American people have a right to know. Fine, but the moment you put it out, it's not just the American people who are reading it. It's the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the North Koreans, and ISIS, and anyone and everyone. So that's why I'm not a whistleblower.
It's a philosophical position. And Nick, look, I don't agree with everything you've said, but I agree with some of the things that you've said. And I understand where people are coming from. If one works within a government body, or where there's classified work, position number one is that there's a reason that certain work is classified, and we must respect that. There's the other side of it, of course, where, in the United States, this goes back at least to the presidency of Jimmy Carter, probably even earlier, where it has been recognized that in Western country, in all countries really, but secrecy can be a law unto itself and can be out of control. And so this is a back and forth issue, hasn't gone away. And what does one say about whistleblowers like in the U.S., like William Binney of the NSA? People revere him, and other people hate him. Binney wrote a lot of the code that is used by the NSA to conduct surveillance against, among other people, the American people, which was not supposed to be happening. And then Binney told the world about it. So there's different sides of it. That's all I'm saying.
Sure. Right? I mean, one more point on this, because I think it is interesting and important. Some people overclassify information. Absolutely. They classify something for incorrect reasons, like, for example, political embarrassment. That's
Oh, yeah.
incorrect use of the
Absolutely.
classification process. Some people underclassify because, frankly, classifying information is jolly hard work, and also all sorts of other rules and processes and procedures come in when you classify things. I mean, the other point is that sometimes it's very subjective. I will classify something, somebody else looking at the same issue the next day might not. So it's a real problem. But sometimes we lose. People don't generally classify for fun, and we mustn't lose sight of the definitions of classified information, which, and I'm paraphrasing, but for example, with top secret information, is information the compromise of which could cause catastrophic damage to the national interest, including serious loss of life. So generally speaking, yes, absolutely, classification is sometimes misused and abused, but generally speaking, it's there for a reason, and a darn good one.
Well, by and large, in the UFO field, most of the information that we're dealing with through documents has come through standard declassification procedures. So I don't think there's a debate there. There are documents that have come through that are leaked and that are disputed. I'm thinking of the Majestic documents. Ryan and Bob Wood have those on their site. We don't have to get into that, but I would say by and large within the UFO field, most researchers work through FOIA. Whether US or UK. The UK's had their own declassification of the MOD papers. You've talked a lot about that. Maybe we can get into that too. I wonder if I can ask you, though, this is a topic you've walked over this one many, many, many times, but if you would just do it here, I would be grateful, which is the Rendlesham Forest case. And the reason I ask this, this is something that it's a case that has been going now for so many decades, so many arguments and differences of opinion. And in the UFO field, there are times, there are waves in which the Rendlesham case just dominates, and people are like, "I'm sick of this case," but it dominates for a reason. It actually is it's a powerful case, and I don't know if we need to go into all of the details here because I think it's fairly well known. But you wrote a book about this, and I know you've thought and talked a lot about it. Can you just give people, why is this important to this day? And what do you think happened this is December 1980?
Let me take the second question first. I don't know what happened. It's one of those bizarre situations where I can tell you what it wasn't, but I can't tell you what it was.
All right, what wasn't it?
It wasn't a practical joke that got out of hand in the military, nor was it some consequence of misuse of alcohol or other controlled substances. It was not a fireball meteor breaking up in the Earth's atmosphere. It was not a misidentification of the local lighthouse. It was not a misidentification of a dummy Apollo capsule that was kept by one of the units on the base. And to the best of our knowledge, neither was it some small prototype aircraft or drone. So, and I went through this process meticulously as part of a cold case review that I conducted in, I think, late 1993, early 1994, officially for the Ministry of Defense, and it is the synthesis of my subsequent involvement in this case. And you mentioned the book that I'd written, Encounter in Rendlesham Forest, where I teamed up with two witnesses, John Burroughs and Jim Penniston, who, along with, I think, Colonel Charles Holt, are probably, I think, the three people absolutely central to this. So, I mean, it's a great case, but like I say, it falls into that 5% unknown, where officially to this day, the Ministry of Defense has no explanation for this.
Is it fair to say that some tangible object, let's call it a craft, did land in that region? And is it fair to say that John Burroughs and James Penniston got very, very close to that craft, and even close enough that James Penniston was able to touch that craft? I mean, you think all of that did happen?
Yes, we have three, I think, well, four tangible pieces of evidence. Firstly, we have the testimony from people like John Burroughs and Jim Penniston themselves. Secondly, we do have some military radar data from a retired Royal Air Force radar operator named Nigel Kerr, who was on duty that particular night and who has testified that there was a brief uncorrelated target tracked over the base at the time. And there are some other documents and testimonies that corroborate that. So we have the testimony from the witnesses, we have the radar data, we have the indentations in the ground. I mean, as you say, this was not lights in the sky. Something landed. And when Colonel Holt and his team went out to this landing site subsequently, now this was a cold December in the UK. The ground was frozen solid, but there were fresh marks where an object that Colonel Holt estimated probably weighed several tons had indeed been present. And the icing on the cake, the fourth piece of evidence, is that radioactivity levels at the landing site were assessed as being significantly higher than the average background. And that's a direct quote from the declassified Defense Intelligence Staff document that forms part of the Ministry of Defense case file on Rendlesham. Munro Nevels was the disaster preparedness officer who Colonel Charles Holt, the deputy base commander, took out with him as part of the investigative process here. And Munro Nevels, who I've subsequently met and discussed this with personally, he had confirmed what was in the Ministry of Defense document, that yes, indeed, this was an anomalous reading, that there were spike readings, I think around 7 times higher than the average background. Now, where this gets really interesting is fast forward to John Burroughs and Jim Penniston having health problems that they attributed.
Yes, I'm glad you're mentioning this.
They had been in a long-running dispute with the VA over this, and of course, they were getting very good support, I think, from the chain of command. People like General Gordon Williams, Colonel Holt were saying to the VA and to others, please do something for these people. However, without the US government saying something tangible happened, it was very difficult. Then the British government declassified an intelligence assessment of the UFO phenomenon, colloquially known as Project Condon. And in Project Condon's final report, buried away in one of the working papers, in one of the annexes, there was a throwaway line. And it said, and I haven't got it in front of me, so I'm paraphrasing, but it said, the well-reported Rendlesham Forest Bentwaters incident is an occasion where it might be postulated that witnesses were exposed to UAP radiation for longer time periods than would normally be the case. Now, UAP is unidentified aerial phenomena. That's the term that we in the Ministry of Defense always used internally to talk about UFOs. John Burroughs and Jim Penniston by this time had been working with a crusading attorney called Pat Frasconia, who had been doing literally hundreds of hours of pro bono work to try and help John and Jim and some others get a settlement from the VA. So Pat Frasconia, of course, got this declassified Ministry of Defense intelligence assessment and said to the VA, hey, wait, look, the British Ministry of Defense have said these guys were probably irradiated. Well, I'm cutting a very long story short because Senator McCain and Senator Kyle and one of their senatorial aides was very heavily involved in this too. But essentially, this was presented to the VA and the VA settled. Certainly for John, I'm not at liberty to discuss Jim's case because I think he's been more tight-lipped about what he has and hasn't done. And even though we've teamed up on the book, I want to respect, obviously, anything that has to do with medical confidentiality. But it's a fascinating story of how a declassified intelligence assessment, the provenance of which is not disputed. This is not some anonymous document that turned up in someone's mailbox. This is something you can read on the National Archives website in the UK.
Yes,
this
absolutely.
was what led to this settlement. So it's a fascinating, disturbing, and complex story.
John Burroughs has been pretty open about it, of course, and I think he's freely stated that I don't think he thinks he would be alive if he were not treated appropriately, and the reason is that he was able to get the U.S. government to actually look seriously into the cause of this damage that occurred to his heart. And so it's a fascinating story. And again, John has talked about this openly many times. Relating to the Condon Report, Nick, it's an amazing report. And I have to confess, it was declassified for a long time. I think around 05, 06, if I'm not mistaken, around the time that you were leaving the MOD.
Yes.
And I think we just kind of ignored it. We ignored it for years.
Well, it was May 2006 when it was formally put onto the Ministry of Defense website as a result of Freedom of Information Act requests by multiple journalists and UFO researchers. And you're quite right, it sat there for a while. There was a flurry of media interest in the UK. But the problem was information overload. This was a 468 odd page report, much of which was highly technical, and frankly, a lot of it went. I don't want to be patronizing, but a lot of it was far too complex for most journalists or people in the UFO community who looked at this. Consequently, what happened was that people skimmed the executive summary, and they didn't do a deep dive into some of this area. So, for example, that's why the throwaway quote about Rendlesham wasn't picked up for years. And I think John Burroughs, amongst others, have got a somewhat testy about this with a number of people, including myself, even though we teamed up on this book, to say, hey, why didn't you do more to raise awareness on this? Well, it's not my job to lead people by the hand, line by line, through a 460 odd page document. But all I can say is, look, it's there, read it. And if people read it, then great. But yes, you're quite correct. For years, it was out there without people realizing its full significance. I think it's a mixed bag. There's some good information in there. Frankly, I think the headline findings, which is speculation about exotic atmospheric plasmas and things, I think is wide of the mark. But don't let's throw out the baby with the bathwater. There's some great information in there. And it's one of the few occasions where, remember earlier, of course, I was bemoaning the lack of trend analysis. Project Condon was one of the few occasions that we did actually sit down and say, let's try and look at this holistically.
Well, when I eventually, finally looked belatedly at the Project Condon report, like everyone else, it did strike me as quite interesting, Nick. And there definitely was this speculation about the military utility of studying these UAP. And what you were just saying was wide of the mark. I'm not so sure. It certainly seemed that they were taking the phenomenon as a reality, as a given, There didn't seem to be any question about that. And B, that there was real great potential military value in studying the technological aspects of this phenomenon. Am I
Very
mistaken?
much so. Yes.
Yeah.
If you actually go and read some of the papers that led to the setting up of Project Condon, and it took a long while. These papers go back to about 1993, and some of them were written by me, and some of them were written to me. And you will find phrases such as speculating quite openly about the extraterrestrial hypothesis and saying, we should not dismiss this out of hand without doing a proper analysis. And there was a line which said quite openly, we could use this technology if it exists. And technology acquisition absolutely gets to the heart of what this is about. And you've read those phrases where it talks about the, quote, novel military applications, unquote, that might derive from a better understanding of the UFO phenomenon, whatever it may turn out to be. And it goes on even to list some of those. And it talks about very high power energy generation, signature reduction, i.e. stealth, and RF weapons, radio frequency weapons. In other words, directed energy weapons. So here we are in a declassified Ministry of Defense study talking quite openly about technology acquisition and weaponization. And absolutely, not just on UFOs, but on all manner of subjects. That's how government looks at things. What are the threats and what are the opportunities?
Very, very interesting. Does it, you ever, I realize like I'm just, it's a fruitless endeavor for me to try to push you to get you to speculate beyond where you want to go. I've tried a number of times privately and I realize it doesn't succeed, but I'm going to try again. Do you ever speculate as to, what offices beyond the ones that you formally have been connected with that might be looking into the UFO, UAP phenomenon, whether in the UK or beyond, if you have any information or any reason to think that there's a deeper secrecy about the UFO phenomenon? I suppose I'm asking you, how far do you think a cover-up goes? Do you think that there's a cover-up in the UK, to the best of your knowledge, or elsewhere for that matter? What are your thoughts about that?
I don't think there's a cover-up in the conventional terms that the UFO community mean by that phrase. In other words, I don't think if you could go to some secret location, certainly in the UK, I can only talk with any knowledge and authority about the position in the UK. I had no access to US programs on this subject. So I have never spoken for the US government. I will never speak for the US government. I can't speak for the US government. But in the UK, it is my view that you will not go to a particular location, open up a hangar somewhere and find some piece of extraterrestrial hardware. That's not to say that I don't rule out the possibility that some of these things might be from somewhere else, but I've seen no smoking gun myself. Of course, you're into that difficult philosophical territory of not being able to prove a negative. Now, I've seen some erroneous media reports suggesting that there were 2 UFO programs in the UK. That's not true. It's simply the case that in our own investigations, there were 2 or 3 different divisions involved. There was my division, which had the policy and investigative lead. There was a defense intelligence staff division, which supplied the scientific and technical assistance in our assessments. And there was a radar division, which obviously did that aspect. So that does not mean there were 2 or maybe even 3 different UFO programs. Can I prove that there wasn't some other office somewhere doing the same as us, but maybe with deeper access? No, of course not. I can say I think it's unlikely based on my security clearance, my need to know, the fact that the Ministry of Defense doesn't usually like duplication of effort and would probably just have canned our program if somebody else was was doing it, but I can never prove it. So, for example, an interesting analogy, and maybe we'll get onto this, but of course the relatively recent revelations about the Pentagon's UFO program, ATIP. I mean, as I mischievously have said to the media and even to Lou Elizondo, you know, the media has now found a UFO program, but have they found the UFO program? And even Lou said, yeah, sure, he's in the same position as me. He can't be 100% sure that there wasn't somebody else, like the Russian dolls. You know, you open one up and there's another one inside, and then there's another and another. So who knows?
Well, in fact, I'm glad you mentioned this. We've got about 5 minutes before we need to wrap this segment up here. I think the word is among the people who did the research on that article, and I mean, including people like Leslie Kane, and there was Ralph Blumenthal and Helene Cooper, who did the New York Times piece on this. There's definitely a lot of chat about there being multiple UFO programs that were informally confirmed, but that are not formally acknowledged. So I'm inclined to think that's true. And when one thinks about the amount of money that is said to have been spent, $22 million over 5 years, it's not a lot of money to look into a program that's got significant, at least if you listen to Elizondo, significant defense implications. And one thing I've wanted to know about ATIP, and I don't know if you can answer this, is what did they actually study? I don't really know what they studied. You know, everyone talks about the Tic Tac UFO. There's the gimbal UFO video. Neither of those are actually from the period that ATIP was supposed to have existed, from 2007 to 2012. So what did they do during those 5 years? I just wonder.
No, I can't speak to that. I was never read onto the program. I had no knowledge of it. My time on the MOD's program was 91 to 94, so obviously that didn't overlap with ATIP. In fact, I left the MOD altogether in 2006, and it's 2006, 2007 that ATIP got going. I have had some discussions with Lou Elizondo about this, and I met him once earlier this year, and I think we discussed enough to realize that there were some differences in the respective programs that we ran, and there are some similarities too. But I would not want to answer that question when I did not sit in DIA, DOD. I'll let
out loud, Nick.
Yeah, I'll let Lou. If you get a hold of him and interview him, I'll let Lou answer that.
But the fact was,
I don't think it would be appropriate for me without having done it from the inside to talk about that.
No, that's fine. I just think it's significant. For years and years in the U.S., we went through this official truth, which was that no, there's no other UFO program. You know, Project Blue Book ended in 1969, and we're done. And then suddenly we learned, oh, well, no, there's this other UFO investigative program that actually seems an awful lot like the old Blue Book, at least as it has been described to us, and almost, you know, offhandedly discussed by some people. So I think it's quite significant. And I'm reminded, I went through a period where I was debating quite a bit with John Alexander, who I know you know quite well as well.
Yes.
And in the 1980s, John Alexander, it's well known now, he was within the Pentagon and sought to find, is there a UFO program? And he wanted in. And he created a group within the Pentagon, a small group called the Advanced Theoretical Physics Group. Howard Bloom, in his book years ago, called it the UFO Working Group, but it was obviously not that name. And John Alexander's position always was, well, I looked for the deeper cover-up. I spoke to generals and everyone else and didn't find any evidence of it. And it's, again, the idea of proving a negative. Like he said, well, I don't believe there's a deeper cover-up because I looked and it wasn't there. So what can you do to that? I've always felt it's there. You just didn't find the right office. But
well, I think with that and with ATIP, it will take probably Congress to get to the bottom of exactly what did go on, what was studied, and what was concluded. And I don't know how much time we have left, but obviously, as you know, the Senate Armed Services Committee is currently looking at the 2004 Nimitz incident. The House Armed Services Committee certainly got a briefing on ATIP, which one would assume covered their outputs and conclusions. It may be that this congressional interest segues into actual congressional hearings, but whether it does or not, we know, for example, from the congressional record that DIA wrote the House Armed Services Committee a brief on ATIP. So if we can get hold of that document, either as is or in redacted form, we may know more to the answers to the questions that you've just posed.
Yeah, we're actually out of time, but I'm hopeful. A lot of people have been very critical of a lot of the things coming out of whether it's TTSA or talking about the ATIP program. I think it's good that this is in the public eye, that we're looking at it and talking about it. And it is true that Elizondo and people connected with him are trying quietly, I think, to get U.S. Congress to look into some of these matters. We'll see how it goes. I'm glad that we're talking about it for sure, and I'm glad that we have the information. There's way more. There's a longer road to go, but I think I agree with you there that it's a good thing that we're discussing this. Hey, Nick, we're out of time for this segment. I think people should know if they want to visit you, they should go to nickpope.net. Is that the best place for them?
Yes, indeed.
It's a great site. It's very nicely designed, I must say. And people can browse through and find all kinds of information relating to what you're about. But I think this has to conclude our segment of this interview, my interview with Nick Pope. To continue this conversation, I would ask people or encourage them to go to my website, richardolanmembers.com, where Nick and I are going to go even further. But for now, that's all we've got the time for, Nick. So let me thank you for this, and we'll have to pick this up again.
Thank you.
My pleasure.